This is the conversation with Diotima from the Center of the History of Women Philosophers here at Paderborn University. My guest today is Professor Antonio Calcagno. I'm very pleased, Antonio, that you're here. Professor Antonio Calcagno from the King's College of Western Ontario in Canada.
Thank you very much.
Antonio joins us now for the third time at the Libori Summer School in Paderborn University. We are very happy.
Likewise.
And I take the chance to ask some questions I would like to discuss with you. Mm-hmm. First of all, you're such a renowned scholar on the women in phenomenology. How did you come about?
It was a kind of wonderful accident or serendipity. I had a very traditional formation, undergraduate formation at the University of Toronto. And in that formation, it was basically the history of philosophy. But there were no women philosophers in that history of philosophy. I was drawn to Husserl and phenomenology as one of my loves. And so I studied phenomenology with the people at Toronto. And then I was reading the New York Times one Sunday, and the cover of the New York Times was splashed, philosopher nun is beatified. I thought, this is such a strange, why would the philosopher nun appear on the New York Times, the weekend edition? And then I read, and it turned out it was Edith Stein. And Edith Stein was the student of Husserl, and I thought, oh, this is fascinating. I've never heard of Edith Stein. So then I started to read, and then I fell in love. I read her autobiography, and I thought, okay, this is the kind of philosopher I want to be. So that's when I fell in love with her philosophy and her person. I thought she was strong and so rich as a thinker, and so this is where it all began for me. And then slowly, through my own studies, I discovered all kinds of interesting phenomenologists that hardly get any attention. And I thought, well, lots of attention has been paid to Heidegger and Husserl, but the whole phenomenological movement, with all of its richness, very little has been paid to this, very little attention has been paid to this whole movement. And I thought, the women in the movement are also so fascinating as well, as they're philosophers in their own right. And so I thought, okay, this could be something that I could bring forward.
So meanwhile, you're well known and worldwide known as an expert, not only of Edith Stein, but I would like to talk about Edith Stein a bit more. And Edith Stein, as you have mentioned right now, and she was beatified then as a nun, and so, but she had more or less, there were three phases in her life which are quite different. So if you explain to us in how these various epochs differ in the development of the philosophy of Edith Stein, and of course we want to hear your opinion on the various stages of her developing the philosophy.
You're right, there are three stages that are traditionally associated with her life. There's the period with Husserl as his student and his private assistant. This is one stage, and in that stage she completed 4 serious works of phenomenology. The famous treatise on empathy, on the problem of empathy. She also did her contributions to the foundations of the humanities and psychology, the Beiträge, which are, she also did on the state. And she also, after she left Husserl, she prepared a whole lecture course called Introduction to Philosophy. And in that beautiful lecture course, you have kind of Edith Stein, the phenomenologist, kind of crystallizing her own philosophical system. It's a very unique work. So that would be her phenomenological stage. Then there's a kind of in-between stage where she is teaching in various institutes, and then she receives an appointment at the Münster Pedagogical Institute. And there, in this period, she's writing on women, she's writing on a bit of scholastic philosophy, she's doing a lot of translation work, and she is developing her own anthropology that draws on phenomenology, but really is a unique blend of her own engagement with other social sciences and psychology. So it's a really quite a unique anthropological, philosophical period. And then there's her last period where she is, well, these two periods, they overlap. So between the second and the third period, you have her more explicit, or moving into the third period, a kind of Christian philosophical corpus that develops, and it's her engagement with a new revelation in her own life, her own faith. So she tries to synthesize in a very deep way some of the insights that she had gathered from her earlier philosophical system with a new philosophical system, which would be the Christian philosophical system. So these are the three kind of periods that you have. I think I mixed up the periods.
That's fine with us. Which one would you like to, which one is the most interesting for you?
For me, the most interesting period is the early period, the more strictly phenomenological period. I think this period is really makes a unique contribution to phenomenological analysis. I think you see her powers as a thinker in this period. I do not think of her as just simply, she has this bad, there's a bad prejudice that surrounds her thought, that she simply just took ideas from Husserl because she had access to his Nachlass and just kind of wove them together in a hodgepodge, some say in a hodgepodge kind of way. So she was just kind of a bad copy of a Husserl that was not public. And I think this is false. I think what you have in Edith Stein is a real critical intervention into how to do phenomenology and what phenomenology is, on top of all the analyses of various particular phenomenon, including empathy, social ontology, politics, and so on. So I think what Stein was a critic, and a deep critic of, in many ways, of her teacher. A very polite critic, but a critic nonetheless. And I think that she was, I think what she believes is that if you're going to do phenomenology, you have to ground it not in the logic of ideas, not in a pure science, but you have to ground it in something fundamental, which is a human being. And so she tried to bring to phenomenology a foundation of the human. A human that has a corporeal part, a psychic part, and a spiritual part. Intellect and reason and psyche combined with body. And she thought that any kind of science has to take account of that fundamental whatness, that fundamental being that undertakes the science. This was not a very popular view for a phenomenology that wanted to be transcendentally pure.
Is this a typical problem between male or female philosophy, which you hold, that there is a transcendental, upraise, which is held to be theoretical, spiritual, and so on, and the bodily care is the feminized part?
I think it could be, but I think when I read Edith Stein, I not only see, because you can find evidence of this kind of split, certainly in her writings on women, where she makes the distinction between a more feminine and a male essence and so on, that we all have. It's not that she bifurcates it in a kind of physical way. But more than that, I think she's just making a philosophical intervention. Edith Stein was incredibly smart. She was incredibly ambitious. She took herself seriously as a philosopher, and made unique philosophical interventions that were not seen to be orthodox. And I think that she has suffered on account of that perceived lack of orthodoxy. But I think what she brings to phenomenology is an attention to another ground. You want the ground of logic, you want the ground of reason, you want the purity of the transcendental, however you conceive of Husserlian transcendental philosophy. And Edith Stein says, this is impossible. You cannot have that purity without something that is in the world, embodied, that has a history, and that has psychology. And you don't need the purity of the transcendental to understand what is phenomenologically unique and possible in philosophy.
Why do you think that these ideas are so bashed, are not accepted, even perhaps not only by Husserl have not been accepted, but still in some kind of treating or understanding philosophy as a philosophical task and so on? Why is it so difficult to bring these foundational ideas of being as a human being in the world and being put into the world and with all the misery?
Yes.
Why is this so ignored?
Well, I think you've hit it right on the head. Human misery, contradiction, the fact that people are doing different things, that everything is not so clear and distinct. This philosophers have abhor. They see themselves as able to bring clarity, reason, rationality, limits, understanding to reality. And
do they have an idealized?
Yes, I think philosophers suffer from a disease. I think philosophers generally they feel great dis-ease at their inability to capture an arche that is, and that never was what they thought it was. I think phenomenology in particular suffers from the crisis of the sciences. This is where it was born. And I think with the defense of Husserl or of the transcendental really is connected to the possibility of a science that can give us clear and distinct solutions, as opposed to a science that is on the way, always making mistakes, that is fallible, correcting itself. And I think that the phenomenology that Edith Stein develops is closer to that more modern, more contemporary view of 20th century science than perhaps what you would have in Husserl and that Kantian tradition of a pure science. Husserl writes endlessly about the crisis in the sciences. He wants to save, in fact, he's probably the last great modern philosopher trying to save that view of science. And he's desperate. And I think those that follow him want to save it too, which is a noble thing. But I think at the same time you have to make room for the fact that, look, reality is in a state of becoming. It's in a state of flux. It's in the science of the 20th century or the mathematics of the 20th century really did a great job at showing that kind of indetermination. And I think with Stein you have that awareness. And you see that crystallized in the 1921 lectures, where she starts with the new science. And she pushes the science away from the transcendental.
Is her speaking on causality, or is this?
No, this is the text where she starts, where she wants to develop a new physics and a new understanding of a new anthropology and a new history. And a new psyche happened earlier. But this is what she's doing. This is what she brings to phenomenology. And I think this is a unique position. It's not the position that philosophy likes, generally, because it plunges us into the...
So I think, and I agree, Edith Stein is a very impressive thinker with a deep strength of philosophical thought. And we have not yet talked about her writings on social philosophy, which she has written and Husserl not has written, you know, her on the state and on the individual and society. But we come to talk about, first I would like to ask you, so in recent years, you also have discovered Gerda Walther. Yes. So what did Gerda Walther bring to you?
I think what Gerda Walther brings to me, and in particular what I like about her phenomenology, her interventions in phenomenology, is she brings a different idea of the social, or she announces the possibility of a social reality that isn't I-based. Mm-hmm. That you can have an experience of sociality that is not always based on an individual. This is a kind of interesting view. And when you think about reality, there are those moments or those experiences of social reality where you either don't know where the I is, because there's some kind of dissociation, or there's some kind of profound feeling of fusion or something like this, where you really feel in solidarity with someone or with a group. And I think Gerda Walther really challenges the egology or the centrality or the primacy of the egology of Husserlian, Steinian phenomenology. I like that about Gerda Walther. Gerda Walther also astutely studies, because her training is in psychology. She's from the Munich school. What I like about her is that she pays close attention to things like dissociation, pathology, what pathology can show philosophy about its claims about a unified, everlasting ego, soul, things like this. This is what I like about Gerda Walther. I think that she has much to say. She shows other aspects of sociality that the traditional phenomenological view in Husserl and Stein don't quite get. They don't want to relinquish the ego.
This is quite interesting, because I always was in favor of the ego as presented in Edith Stein, and this leads us to the next question. So Edith Stein's ego-based concept of a society, the individual in the society, and on the other hand, the very different we experience in Gerda Walther. And as you are starting, and during the last years, you have contributed to various papers, also comparing the two. I would like to hear first, what is the different idea on the we and on the community in both, in Edith Stein and Gerda Walther?
I think one of the fundamental difference, I think, is this, that Edith Stein really believes that the most intense form of community, where you live, where one lives in the experience of the other in some kind of profound solidarity, is grasping the meaning of a certain experience of community, this most intense form. It's grasping the sense or the meaning of that solidarity. But for Edith Stein, that can only be because you are embodied, you are individuated. The experience of that community is really fundamentally lodged in a series of different individuated egos. So it's not that the egos ever really lose their individuality. What happens is that you understand or enter into the sense or the meaning of the other, of others that form a community. So what it is that an I grasps the sense of a community, but it's still an I. Gerda Walther says, yes, she doesn't deny this. She says, okay, you have instances where you have this, but there are also intense forms of community where you lose yourself, where you fuse, and you become part of something bigger. And she gives lots of examples of this. And what I like, so both have limits. What I like about Walther is that she says, okay, community could be so intense that perhaps you lose yourself. And Walther, if you read the Phenomenology of Mysticism, this is a very interesting work, because the Phenomenology of Mysticism, apart from its analysis of mystical experience and so on, there's a whole egology there. And in the manuscripts that we have that she wrote in addition to her Phenomenology of Mysticism, she is torn. So on one hand, Gerda Walther wants to tell you that, okay, you can have an I community, but you can also have something that is a real fundamental we community that transcends the experience of the I. But Gerda Walther, if you read in particular the Phenomenology of Mysticism, she's also torn. Because in her description of, so one of the contributions that Gerda Walther makes phenomenologically is she actually sketches in various texts what it is for you to have something like an interiority outside of psyche. So what it is for you to experience something like your own inner life. What does it mean for you to have something like interiority? And what's interesting in her discussions of interiority is that she, because she analyzes things like psychotic breaks, dissociation. So on one hand, she starts her analysis of the ego in the classic phenomenological way, positing the ego as a kind of unified field, as individuated, as having a sense of its wholeness. But then she realizes, as you analyze psychiatric phenomena, psychological phenomena, disease, mental illness, her analyses of religious experience, she says, I have lots of evidence to say that I never really was so unified, that it was never really such a pure ego pole. But she's torn, so you see this contradiction in her text. I like that in Gerda Walther, in the sense that she brings the other side of ego life to the table and says, well, what do you do with not the reflecting, unified I of philosophy, but the I of psychology, the I of experience that experiences itself not in a unified, synthetic way? There are breaks. Those breaks allow her, this is how she justifies philosophically the possibility that you have something like fusion. It's not that just that you have it, it's just that there are also, the conditions for it lie in the very eyes, the ego's lack of always being unified, whole, I-pole. So she announces a kind of rupture.
But this is very up to date.
It's very up to date. I think it's also this is what's interesting about Gerda. I think that there's been a great resistance in Husserlian phenomenology.
This would be true for me too, because I was used to the I as a strong
we
condition.
like the I.
We like the
we
I.
like the I. It allows all kinds of things
Yes.
for us, right? It also gives us a kind of control, a kind of understanding of reason and so on.
Yeah.
And Gerda Walther says,
Yeah.
this I is problematic because other sciences tell us that the I is not so unified, not so...
And you're right. And modern philosophy, influenced by neurophilosophy, doesn't.
Yeah, you think of Searle, he questions whether there is this intentionality of the I or other thinkers.
And the many eyes that we are. And
so Gerda Walther actually is not afraid to talk about this. And sadly, people read this as a weakness in her philosophy, but I think it's actually open-minded. She's avant la lettre. Thinking philosophy, a kind of phenomenology avant la lettre. Yeah.
That seems so.
Yeah.
Because modern neurophilosophy is saying exactly that.
And she also gives you a break from your own I-ness. Right? This is what's wonderful about Gerda Walther. She says, she announces the possibility of maybe you don't want to always be a thinking ego. Maybe you don't always want to be, or maybe you can't be. And so this frees up the hardcore structure of the philosophical ego that we find in phenomenology, classic phenomenology. I think this is good.
Okay, let's go back to scholarly education that Gerda Walther and Edith Stein went through. Edith Stein wrote her dissertation on empathy and close or in order for Husserl or whatever. But as I have read in your papers, empathy is a big issue in Gerda Walther too. So what is the difference?
So there are in Edith Stein there are really two big accounts of empathy. One finds her doctoral dissertation, and then you have the account that you find in the Introduction to Philosophy, which was written after she had full access to Husserl's texts. And so the first account of empathy that you get in Edith Stein, empathy does all kinds of interesting things. It gives you knowledge of another's mind, but it also allows you to see your own essence and the essence of all people as a human being. And it also gives you self-knowledge, which is foundational, she says, for all sciences. Which is what you see when she reworks ideas 2 and 3. Ideas 3, this idea of kind of a human communal base of scientific undertaking and so on. This is Stein's reworking of the Husserlian project. This is what empathy was at first. By the time we get to the second Steinian account of empathy, empathy really becomes very close. Empathy becomes very limited in what it can give you. She says, it gives you very specific amount of information. All it really gives you is basically essentially a glimpse into the mind of the other as a kind of Vergegenwärtigung. So she follows that classic Husserlian limited view. So you have these two kind of views of empathy in Edith Stein. Gerda Walther is much more pragmatic. She says, look, in the text in the Phenomenology of Mysticism, in the and the text on social ontology, ontology of communities, she just basically says, look, empathy can give you access to other minds. It is the foundation for larger communal awareness. That's it. That's good. This is what it could do. But there's something different than empathy that happens, which is Stein's position as well, where you have something like a we consciousness. And for Walther, it's a much more radical kind of position. The problem with Steinian empathy is that you really don't know how it fits into we communities. She tells us it's foundational, it gives us certain kinds of information, it lays the ground, but how exactly it moves into communal consciousness, or how it fits, it's just a break. So, all right. So Walther is much more pragmatic and almost reductive about empathy. She doesn't have hope. Edith Stein has great hope in empathy. And I'm not sure if that hope comes from her listening to Husserl's lectures on nature and spirit, or whether it's just her own. I think it's her own, like drawing from Husserl. I think what she sees, she wants to find something that will give her hope to understand the broader human condition.
But it always is based on the I, so I'm not so sure if she really wants to get into empathy. I always liked very much that, so at least I read it like that she's very distant. You're right. She understands that she needs the concept to get in contact. But at least I had the impression it always remains in distance.
I think she moves away from it. Like I think you're right. I think that that's very interesting what you're saying here. I think that's because in the Introduction to Philosophy that was written later, some years later, very limited view. So maybe we can find in the introduction confirmation of what you put forward here, which is, wonderful. Because I think Stein really is the thinker of, I think she's really the thinker of the social and the political. I think the I is a base, but I really do think that her unique phenomenological contribution is the social and political ontology that she develops, I think.
So what is, according to your own philosophical statement, the very important issue in phenomenology? Why doing phenomenology?
I think what phenomenology, as a movement, I think what phenomenology tried to make present or give to philosophy is the idea that experience, that all of reality is not reducible simply to either empirical or psychological or quantitative measurement. There are aspects of reality that can only be grasped through human experience. Things like a social bond, the experience of what it is to be a human being, what it is to be a person. These kind of things, they become accessible in phenomenology in a way, in a very rich way, that perhaps is not the same as what a sociologist would say or other forms of scientists would say. I think it brings another layer
and
of analysis.
This is much, you prefer that instead of, let's say, a Kantian foundation of where to start to look into the world?
I do. I do, because I think that it's the Kantian system is invested in trying to show limits of things, and in a very, I think, in a very interesting way. But I think it's in its attempt to distinguish one limit from another, it's suffused with a certain idea of what science is and can achieve. Kant is really, he is an eternal optimist, I think, in this regard. And what I find interesting about phenomenology is it loosens up the Gesetzlichkeit of Kant in a way that allows you to analyze things, a more robust line of things that perhaps fit or fall between his, limits, if you will. So I like that about phenomenology.
Okay, but then we come to the problem if phenomenology can give what has been promised by Kant to get a kind of orientation for life.
I think I have to be honest here. I think Kant probably is better on that score than the phenomenological.
Yes, but it was the wrong orientation, kind of orientation.
Yeah. but what they show is perhaps I think they're sympathetic to what Kant wants to do. Absolutely, this kind of improvement of humanity, improvement of our situation, to think the world in a different way, social world. Science, but I think what is unique about phenomenology or contemporary phenomenology is they turn to other phenomena that are contemporary in a way that perhaps Kant couldn't access.
So you think that phenomenology is still the methodology to describe the world of today?
It's one. I would say it's one.
What is the other?
I think we have many. I think that I think we have to be faithful to what science teaches us, and what science and philosophy, or certain streams of philosophy, teaches that, look, knowledge comes in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of forms, and you need to be open to what all the different sciences tell you, to the mistakes you make, to what history teaches you, what philosophy teaches you. I don't think we can have one ground.
But this sounds very phenomenologically based.
Well, it is, but if you think of modern, like Cantor or Kuhn, or you think of contemporary or Heisenberg, or the new science, Einstein, I think you have to be open. I think you have to be open. The knowledge will come in different forms. I don't think that we can privilege one over the other, which is much to the sadness of philosophy as a... I think philosophers want the arche. They still want to be able to deliver that kind of unified principle source, but this is, we can no longer do it. I don't think we ever did, but this mythology, I think we need to stop with that. And I think that the more fragmentary nature of contemporary phenomenology perhaps allows us more freedom to still perhaps look for understanding, but not in a completely, how shall I say, older way that modern science challenges, I think. So I think that's where I would go. I don't know if that makes any sense. Sorry.
I think this is wonderful. This is wonderful.
I think we need to,
to hear these, and I think, we can leave it with that.
Okay.
This is a wonderful personal statement.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was
for being with us.
It was a great pleasure to have a chat with you. Yeah. Thank you.